Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome everyone to the first hearing of the 116th Congress for this subcommittee, and I also want to welcome the new members of our subcommittee. This hearing is now called to order without objection. Members have 5 legislative days in which to submit their statements and materials for the record. And since I don't have a gavel, I'll just knock on the table. So given that there are many new members on this subcommittee, I wanted to take time for the first few hearings to really do an overview of the jurisdiction. I mean, we are blessed to have our ranking member here who has been on this committee and working in the subject area for more than 3 decades. But for the new members that are here, we really wanted to take time and review all of the different subject areas. So delving into U.S. policy toward Africa, having a hearing on global health, looking at international organizations, and we'll do this through a series of hearings. I also wanted to invite the members to a meeting that we're going to have on March 11th, which will be with all of the ambassadors from the African continent. And in April, we will do a congressional delegation to Africa, looking at the role of the U.S. military on the continent. This specific hearing focuses on the intersection of global health, human rights, and international organizations. The world is experiencing what many experts say is an unprecedented humanitarian and displacement crisis. I'm sure many of us have seen images flash across our TV screens that include massive numbers of citizens displaced from Syria, Myanmar, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Yemen, and others. But we also have to acknowledge that this is also happening right here on our own doorstep. According to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in 2017, more than 68 million people were forcibly displaced worldwide. Those displaced included 25 million refugees, 3.1 million asylum seekers, and 40 million IDPs are internally displaced persons. People leave their countries for a variety of reasons, but most are forcibly displaced due to armed conflict, widespread or indiscriminate violence, human rights violations, and our persecution. Another category of displaced people includes the millions affected yearly by natural disasters such as earthquakes, storms, or drought. We can all imagine that the choice to leave one's home cannot be easy. After escaping some of the most challenging circumstances in their home countries, these migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers endure difficult journeys that often puts them at risk for exploitation. While there are many more cases, including people displaced from Afghanistan, Iraq, Sudan, and South Sudan, the situations I've referenced highlight that there are numerous root causes for why people are forced to leave. This is why it is critical for the United States to continue to support the State Department and USAID, given that their programs are often aimed at investing in women, girls, and youth. It's better to address the root causes for why people have to leave their countries. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the United States is also confronting our own challenges on how to engage with refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers. As we watch images of these vulnerable populations making their difficult journeys, we have to ask the same questions that we were asked if it were the Rohingya arriving exhausted, hungry, and sick after walking for days through jungles or mountains or braving dangerous sea voyages. This is important because we should also hold ourselves accountable. It's also important because it gives us more credibility in the world as we attempt to tackle the important issue of displaced persons around the world. I look forward to hearing the testimony of our witnesses as we attempt to understand the magnitude of this crisis. And I want to thank the witness, especially our colleague, Representative Raul Ruiz. And I yield to my friend and colleague, Ranking Member Smith.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, congratulations to you on taking over the helm of this very, very important committee. It's been my privilege, as you said, to be on it, and as either chairman or ranking member since the 1990s. So it was great to be with you, and we have worked very well together over the last several years, and I deeply appreciate that. We have been bipartisan on so many important issues. We've traveled together to places. We've been denied entry, for example, most recently to DR Congo,
Yes.
but we did get into certainly Ethiopia. We've been to as well to South Sudan and had some very contentious meetings with Salva Kiir, very much deserved for his dropping the ball, particularly when it comes to refugees, IDPs, and basic humanitarianism. Today's hearing is an interesting and a complex topic, a very important topic, and I think it's right that we focus on refugees and IDPs. I would like to sidestep some of the politics and focus instead on one category of people. But before I do, I would note, and I think it is worth noting, that according to CRS, the U.S. continues to be the largest donor of humanitarian assistance worldwide, providing nearly 1/3 of the total global contributions, more than $7 billion in 2016, $9.3 billion in 17, and $9.4 billion in 2018. The UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs anticipates that in 2019, more than 132 million people worldwide will require humanitarian assistance and protection as a result of conflict and disaster. Moreover, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees says that in 2018, more than 68.5 million people were forcibly displaced worldwide due to armed conflict, widespread or indiscriminate violence, or human rights violations. And a huge number of people, a great burden on each of these individuals and their families, the governments that often are inadequate because of resources to care for them, putting an even more burden on the developed countries to step up and to assist. I would point out that, last Congress, I introduced H.R. 390 to assist those men and women who are escaping from ISIS. I chaired no less than 10 congressional hearings on their plight. There were 70,000 strong who made their way into Erbil. Every one of them a survivor of ISIS genocide. And I'm happy to say that the bill was signed into law in December, and it is designed to assist those individuals who went largely unassisted during several years of genocide by ISIS. I do believe that there are a large number of people who are people of faith all over the world, including the people in China who are kind of internally displaced, given that they're in concentration camps, put there deliberately, the Muslim Uyghurs, because of Xi Jinping's horrific crackdown on religion. He calls it sinification. It's an effort to say that everyone, whether you be Falun Gong, Christian, Tibetan Buddhist, or a Muslim Uyghur, or anyone else, need to comport with and conform with the communist ideology, or else. You go to a gulag, you become internally displaced, and you are just harassed and, in many cases, tortured. In the last administration, we did have trouble with allowing Christians from Syria to come in to the United States, and I held hearings on that as well. It was less than 0.5% who came as refugees, and I think that was unfortunate, and it could have been rectified. I never got to the bottom as to why that was the case. There was reliance on the UNHCR, which I greatly admire and respect as an organization, but frankly, there were a lot of Christians who simply wouldn't go there. If they did, the women would be harassed, sexually abused, raped in many cases, and the men would be beaten. So they chose another route. Many went to Lebanon, many went to Erbil in the case of the Christians who escaped. And again, I went and visited, talked to those people, and they wondered, where was the United States? Why were you not helping us? That is being rectified. And Anna Issue, who was the co-sponsor of my bill, we had a number of bipartisan co-sponsors, including the gentlelady who is now chair, really is making the difference to reach out to those people who are persecuted and so maltreated. We also need to continue to help the Rohingya in Burma, who are persecuted, the Ahmadiyya of Pakistan, who are considered apostate by the Sunni majority and are in greater need of asylum as well. And again, to underscore the Muslim Uyghurs, this number approximates what we saw in the Second World War, with so many people being put into concentration camps. Last year, I had 2 hearings on this. One woman, Mariegul, who was a Muslim Tursan, testified and said she was tortured in the chair, a hideous device used by the Chinese government, and was hoping for death. She goes, I wanted to die. It was just so painful. And why was she asked her jailer, why am I being so maltreated? He said, because you're a Uyghur and because you're Muslim. Those 2 things. And so I think the whole world has to speak up even more aggressively to this carnage being visited upon people of faith and others who don't conform to the communist dictatorship in Beijing. And again, we need to do more, always more, for refugees and IDPs, because they are, and I do see my old friend who used to be at the National Security Council for the Clinton administration, who, when we had a problem with people who were being forced back to Vietnam pursuant to the Comprehensive Plan of Action, and I thought it was a very major mistake on some within the Clinton administration to do so. We had a friend and ally in Eric Schwartz. In fighting, I offered an amendment on the floor of the House to deny any funding for forced repatriation. It passed unexpectedly. People thought it wouldn't. And then working with Eric and other like-minded, but he took the lead within the administration, we were able to get re-reviews of these refugees, and 20,000 people who were originally told, you don't qualify, came to the United States. So it's great to see Eric.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ranking Member. Let me introduce our first witness, U.S. Representative Raul Ruiz. Grew up in the community of Coachella, California, where both of his parents were farm workers. Dr. Ruiz graduated from UCLA. He went on to Harvard, where he earned his medical degree, as well as a Master's of Public Policy from the Kennedy School of Government and a Master's of Public Health from the School of Public Health, becoming the first Latino to earn 3 graduate degrees from Harvard University. He completed his residency in emergency medicine, and during his training, he served as a consultant to the Ministries of Health in both Serbia and El Salvador. In 2010, Dr. Ruiz started the Coachella Valley Healthcare Initiative, which brought together stakeholders from around the region to address local healthcare crisis. In 2010, Dr. Ruiz flew to Haiti immediately following the 2010 earthquake and served as the medical director for the Haitian Relief Organization. The U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne awarded him the Commander's Award for Public Service. I appreciate you coming and testifying, and please begin.
Good morning, Chair Bass and Ranking Member Smith. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee to discuss a critical and urgent matter, the treatment of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. It's a topic I moved to discuss because, frankly, our federal government needs a lesson on the humanitarian standards that should govern our treatment of the individuals in our custody. Some background on me: I am an emergency medicine physician and a graduate of Harvard Medical School. I am also a graduate of the Harvard School of Public Health, where I specialized in humanitarian aid and disaster response, and completed a fellowship in the International Emergency Medicine with the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. In 2010, I traveled to Haiti immediately following the devastating earthquake, where I worked alongside the 82nd Airborne Division as the medical director of the largest camp of approximately 70,000 internally displaced Haitians in Pétionville, Port-au-Prince. Caring for individuals in life or death situation is not new to me in the emergency department or as medical command or out in the field after a humanitarian disaster. I am very familiar with the international humanitarian norms that guide our treatment of individuals affected by humanitarian crisis. As this committee knows well, after the atrocities of the Holocaust and World War II, the international community came together many times to establish, through conventions, covenants, and declarations, to establish basic humanitarian standards. Some of these include the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. The implementation of these standards make up the basis of the humane treatment of all human beings. There are also specific guidelines for the humane treatment of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. The Sphere Handbook, internationally recognized for its use in the evaluation, planning, and delivering of humanitarian operations, set forth guidelines for health, shelter, nutrition, hygiene, water supply, and sanitation. International organizations such as the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the International Committee of the Red Cross have also established standards of care for asylum seekers in detention. The United States is currently not meeting these minimal basic standards. Following the death of Jacqueline Cajal, the 7-year-old Guatemalan girl who died in Customs and Border Patrol custody last year, I visited the CBP facilities where she was held before her death. The conditions I witnessed were heartbreaking. Women, infants, toddlers, and the elderly packed and piled on top of each other in a cold, windowless concrete room, so many bodies you couldn't see the floor. Open toilets in crowded cells without any privacy. Visibly sick children coughing on one another. The facility lacked life-saving equipment and basic medications for infants and toddlers. No diapers, no baby food, no formula, no feminine products available. In short, they were understaffed, under-equipped, and unprepared to provide meaningful health screenings to individuals in their custody, let alone respond to medical emergencies. We are the wealthiest nation on earth, but the conditions I saw were worse than those I saw in Haiti after their most challenging and devastating disaster. It is clear to me that these deficiencies put children and our agents at risk. As a public health expert, I know that if border personnel had access to the necessary resources, training, and medical backup, they could triage and prevent more tragedies. This isn't just about treating individuals in our custody in a humane manner. It is also a matter of law. Both the U.S. law and international law give individuals the right to seek asylum. In the event that the federal government restricts the free movement of an individual, including their detainment by U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, then it is the federal government's responsibility to provide for these basic rights and to ensure the protection of their humanity throughout the asylum process. That is why I'm drafting legislation that would implement a basic set of uniform humanitarian standards to guide the way CBP cares for detained asylum-seeking children, families, and high-risk individuals that reflects our humanitarian values. First, to prevent deaths in CBP custody, we need to meaningfully address the health needs of individuals entering our borders, especially for vulnerable populations like infants, children, pregnant women, elderly, and the disabled. That requires an initial medical screening, including vital signs and a basic physical exam to identify risks, signs, and symptoms of life-threatening vulnerabilities. Second, we need to better respond to emergencies by having emergency medical equipment available for patients of all ages and trained medical personnel to administer emergency care. Third, we need to provide individuals in temporary custody with safe, hygienic, and humane temporary shelters to address public health and uphold human dignity. These are straightforward reforms based on the international standards outlined previously and my experience working in the emergency department and alongside disaster medical assistant teams and the U.S. Army in Haiti. They will bring humanity back to our treatment of women and children seeking asylum and prevent needless loss of life. Migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers around the world have the courage to leave the devastating and often dangerous conditions in their home countries and travel to find safety and a better future for themselves and their families. That was the case with the men and women who founded our nation, seeking freedom, refuge, and a better life. I look forward to working with you and CBP to bring the conditions that children and families are held under here in the United States in line with the basic humanitarian standards observed in even the most dire and severe circumstances across the globe.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rees. We expect votes to be called in the next 10 minutes, so I'm going to keep us, we don't have a clock here, but I have my stopwatch, so I'll keep us to asking questions for 5 minutes, and I'll be brief to give more opportunity to my colleagues. Dr. Rees, given that I don't see the situation ending anytime soon on our border, and looking at resources that might be proposed by this committee and legislation, and you just mentioned legislation you were talking about as well, what resources, what should we ask USAID or other governmental entities to provide on the border? And then I'm also thinking about the people, you know, I hope at another hearing we could look at addressing the root causes of why so many people are coming from Central America. I mean, we are providing aid to Central America, but I don't know that that aid that we're providing is really getting at the root causes so that people don't make the journey in the first place. So I think that's for another hearing. But if you're thinking about the people after they leave on that journey, what type of aid should we be giving to those countries so that once they leave, they are dealt with safely? And also when they're at the border, what would you recommend?
In terms of aids to the other country, or? the needs of our own country to address the
Both. I'm
humanitarian
actually
standards.
referring to both.
So let's go ahead and first start with the aid to other countries. First of all, we know that many and the vast majority of the asylum seekers are fleeing violence and threats, oftentimes due to drug cartels or gang members that exist within what I would refer to as a failed state in a non-traditional way, in the sense that their own governments cannot provide law and order and safety for their communities. Oftentimes they are the villages in the remote areas, indigenous communities, who are socially isolated without the social capital to gather and protect themselves, that are preyed upon. And so what we can do to provide assistance to create that order and safety and security for their populations would be very helpful. There are many who come as economic migrants, and building the opportunities for micro loans, for example, for women and children. Studies have shown that has helped in places like India and Africa to foster community development at a grassroots community level, which will give them hope, opportunity, and the means to provide for themselves and their family. In terms of the United States, my legislation and my focus is on the what, creating these basic humanitarian standards and allowing CBP and Department of Homeland Security to determine the how, because they will need flexibility to meet these specific needs. So what is in the what? For example, I think that they need to be able to have partnerships or have more individuals who know how to conduct a questionnaire and vital signs and a rudimentary physical examination, especially starting with vulnerable populations like infants, toddlers, pregnant women, elderly, and the disabled. And then once identified an abnormality, to be able to consult with an emergency care professional who can then triage and determine a short medical plan of observation or treatment, or even immediate evacuation. If that was done in Antelope Wells, where Jacqueline Caal was detained, then she would still be alive today, because no child looks healthy 8 hours before they die of septic shock. Right?
point.
They don't look healthy. If you would have just done a rudimentary vital signs on a child, you would have found most likely temperature, fast heart rate, and that would have alerted to you that there's something wrong with the child.
They didn't have the resources there, right? I mean,
They didn't have
weren't
the
medical
resources,
people.
and they didn't have the care. So resources, making sure that there's medical equipment for infants and toddlers, which there was none. You need resources like basic formula, baby food. Oftentimes families and individuals are given a box with a burrito. Infants, neonates, toddlers, that's not what they eat, and they don't eat that. And so being able to provide the sufficient amount of clean water, as well as the nutrition caloric intake of an adult, and age-specific, weight-based for children is important. Other things like soap and toothbrush and toothpaste, and a facility where they can wash their hands or bathe daily will go a long way with public health. When you pile individuals in a concrete room that's cold, and you keep the lights on, and people are awake all night, all day, their immune system decreases. When you add the stressors of what they've gone through, including the being exposed to people coughing and sneezing on them, you're going to infect everybody, and you're going to, with a common cold or what other virus may exist that they acquired at that facility. And so being able to have enough private clean toilets, latrines for a certain amount of people in the international humanitarian norms. It's usually one latrine per 15, 20 individuals. We worked with international organizations to provide that amount of latrines in Port-au-Prince and in Haiti. So those are some of the equipment. For example, temperature adequate clothing and blankets and bedding. What I saw at the Border Patrol station were very thin aluminum sheets, and they pretty much try to sleep on the floor. Oftentimes, they would, make accommodations so that their child could sleep on their arm or on their chest, so they wouldn't have to sleep on the floor. And these are the diapers for babies, for example, is also very important because a child's feces is more infectious than an adult's feces. And if you don't provide diapers or a disposal area where you can throw them away and wash your hands afterwards, then you're risking exposure to everybody. And that's just basic public health.
Thank you. Mr. Smith?
Thank you very much, Doctor, for your testimony. Let me just ask you, you say the U.S. border facility in Lordsburg was understaffed, under-equipped, and unprepared to provide meaningful health screenings to people in their custody, let alone emergency medical services. Has that changed?
The CBP has requested some change after our encounter. They've requested more fundings through the appropriations to be able to contract with healthcare professionals. When I went to the border, the agents were still devastated from the death of Jacqueline Caal. They're humans, they're fathers as well, and mothers, and so they were in sorrow, and they often expressed anxiety and fear of now dealing with families and children where they have no experience and no training to do so. And so they're welcoming these resources and these norms and trainings.
When were you in Lordsburg?
I think it was in December, I believe. It was Antelope Wells in December. I went as a delegation with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus.
So, like in January, do you know if any of it's been fixed?
They're requesting. There are certain areas that they're focusing more, bringing in these resources, but I cannot tell you to the full extent whether or not the systemic problem has been fixed. They haven't started trainings.
But in you and your staff recontact like a month later,
Sure.
2 months later, did they tell you, we got this fixed, we're doing health screening?
No,
we're doing
we have been following up with the commissioner and task forces within CBP. I've been advising the task force for CBP on these humanitarian and public health criteria and standards. They're still developing their recommendations for the Secretary of DHS. So this is a work in progress. It has not been fixed.
But given, the very dire picture you paint, it seems to me that by the next week, they should have been moving heaven and earth to get this fixed. That's not the case?
Well, I agree with your assessment that they should have been moving heaven and earth to meet those criterias. They started looking into how to do it, but I don't believe that these standards have been met.
Okay. Is Lordsburg the exception, or is it the rule for these facilities?
Well, I think that the facilities that we visited were one of the most remote and rural areas. So it was probably be one of the more worst case scenarios. However, the problem that we see is that the conditions or the current treatment is very vague and inconsistent throughout the different border patrol. And part of that is a lack of fundamental understanding of how to respond to the humanitarian needs of asylum seeker, which our laws permit and which we have been accustomed to within the international humanitarian community. So what we need is a systematic way to bring in these humanitarian norms and standards and have training for our agents and those within the agency so we can meet those requirements.
Doctor, is this a new problem, or does this predate this new administration?
I believe we've had...
If I could,
No,
we have had hearings in the past, and I asked questions previously, many questions about whether or not, for example, neglected tropical diseases were being screened for, since there are many who could be carrying worms or other parasites. And I got a big, we don't know. And, we followed up, we keep asking. My question would be, is this something that just happened in the last 2 years, or does this predate this administration?
Well, the movement of asylum-seeking migrants has been going on for several years and predates this administration.
Right. But in terms of the crisis and the lack of providing essential medical health care to those in need, is this brand new?
This is an issue that hasn't been addressed, period. So
Even before this
even
administration?
before. Yes.
It's important because, we want to be fair to all players.
Well, yeah,
Um,
see, I think it's important to understand.
We wanna get it
and
right.
This is something that we've been talking with CBP about, and they recognize that they were not designed to address the humanitarian needs of families and children. And that's why this is a great opportunity for us as legislatures and experts in the field to come together in a bipartisan way to help the CBP reform so that they can address the humanitarian needs of asylum seekers.
But again, I just wanted to make clear for the record that it does predate the Trump administration. Yes?
Yeah, the lack of humanitarian norms within a system has never been in our CBP.
Okay.
Thank you.
If I could, one final
Oh,
question?
sure.
Yeah.
The, when unaccompanied minors was absolutely, a great focus, as it should be, I went to one of the shelters, and there were staff from one of my senators who was there as well. It's in New Jersey. And frankly, I was shocked on the upside just how well they were being treated. Because I had heard the dire story. We always want to
Where
know
did you go?
they don't want us to tell you, and I'll tell you off the record.
Oh, yeah,
Because
yeah,
they don't want
yeah,
people knowing where it is, but it's in New Jersey.
Yeah.
And there must have been 40 young people there, and they were very well treated. Now, there could be others where they're very poorly treated, but, Cory Booker's staff was there with me, and Leonard Lance was there, and I was there, and we stayed for hours asking questions, talking to the young people who were there. So I always want to get it clear, one, if this is all brand new, because I think it is longstanding, because we've had hearings in this Congress that predated Trump. And there's been a call for a significant increase in humanitarian aid by the administration.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good thing. I think we
I-
need to provide that. So you would agree with that?
Yeah, and also I just want to make it clear that unaccompanied minors are detained in several situations. They're not there with ICE, and that's one set of facilities. And then they are also in the care of the Office of Refugee Resettlement under the Department of Homeland Security. And they oftentimes contract with nonprofits and community agencies which provide homes and programs and education. So what we're not seeing that model, which I also visited a location in Los Angeles, throughout the whole system, and there are unaccompanied minors that do not get treated or have the services like those that are under the care of the Office of Refugee Resettlement.
I'm going to move on. Mr. Phillips?
Thank you, Chairwoman Bass, and greetings to my esteemed colleague. I celebrate your extraordinary passion for this work and grateful to you. My first question is relative to funding, and the White House has acknowledged that we have a humanitarian crisis at the border, asked for funding. We approved, I think, $414 million, if I recall correctly. Do you believe that's an adequate amount to fulfill the humanitarian responsibilities?
No, I don't think that is sufficient to meet the what that we need to address. But that is a very good first step. Those conversations occurred within the appropriate appropriations subcommittees, and we have been working with the appropriations subcommittees of Department of Homeland Security to identify these humanitarian norms. So right now there's a working relationship to get the requests in line with what these humanitarian norms are. And that was the 2019 appropriations bill that we just passed. In 2020, there will be another step to bring them in line to the humanitarian standards that should exist in CBP custody.
Okay, I know we have to run. One more quick question, if I might. Are you familiar with a country around the world that does this better than we do? And if so, that we should look to for a source of best practices?
I think that the source of best practices would be within the international humanitarian community. If you look at organizations that manage large internally displaced camps and refugee camps throughout the globe, ICRC, and some practices from the UN Commissioner for Refugees, and Doctors Without Borders, who do this day in and day out, oftentimes at risks of their own life in the most dire disasters in the most impoverished countries. and they're able to meet the nutritional water needs to provide a camp that is reflective of human dignity. And so I think that working with them and realizing what their standards are would be a very good idea.
And employing that in our home country. I
Yep.
appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate you coming as our expert witness. Appreciate your input, and I look forward to joining you on your legislation.
Thank you.
So votes have been called. I'm going to recess subject to the call of the chair, and I would encourage members to return. I believe we have 2 votes, so we should be back in half hour, 45 minutes. Thank you. Could I call the panel forward? Eric Schwartz, Ryan Mace, Anjahi Johanna. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. Sorry we were pulled away for votes, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Eric Schwartz has been the president of Refugees International since June 2017. He has a 3-decade career focused on humanitarian and human rights issues. Between 2009 and 2011, he served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration. As Assistant Secretary, he was credited with strengthening the State Department's humanitarian advocacy around the world, initiating and implementing critical enhancements to the U.S. Refugee Settlement Program, and raising the profile of global migration issues in U.S. foreign policy. Ryan Mace is the grassroots advocacy and refugee specialist for Amnesty International. He works to mobilize constituent pressure to advance AIUSA's major advocacy initiatives, in addition to lobbying Congress to protect and advance the rights of refugees and asylum seekers. Our third witness, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, Ms. Buwalda. From 91 through the present time, Ann Buwalda has served as Executive Director of Jubilee Campaign USA, focusing on international religious freedom, advocating for the release of prisoners of conscience and resettlement of refugees, combating trafficking for the protection of children, and providing support to victims. In practice since '92, Ms. Buwalda founded the law firm Just Law International in '96, a firm handling all aspects of immigration law, including asylum and refugee cases. Thank you very much, and you can begin your testimony. And we have your full statements, so if you could summarize in 5 minutes, that would be greatly appreciated. And I will keep a clock here. Thank you. You turn your microphone on.
I would like to thank Chairwoman Bass, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the subcommittee for providing the opportunity to address the panel on the crisis of religious and ethnic minority refugees and asylum seekers in Thailand and elsewhere. The U.S. has traditionally been a beacon of hope for the oppressed and persecuted suffering around the world. And even in one of his statements, Ronald Reagan said, quote, "Can we doubt that only a divine providence placed this land, this island of freedom, here as a refuge for all these people in the world who yearn and breathe to be free?" It's a sincere hope that today's hearing will contribute to renewing the calling that the divine providence has placed on this land. Jubilee Campaign seeks to draw the subcommittee's attention to the need to protect and aid religious minority refugees. Under both international refugee law and domestic asylum law, one of the 5 grounds of protection is a well-founded fear of persecution on account of one's religion. At times, religious refugees have been placed behind other types of refugees. Indeed, that was one of the reasons that the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998 was so needed, and it has been a remarkably effective tool since then, and we're very pleased with many of the provisions within it. Those provisions, I think, need to be applied as it relates to refugees and refugee processing. My testimony today seeks to expose the circumstances in Thailand pertaining to vulnerable refugee populations, those seeking asylum from Pakistan. Verifiable statistics are difficult to obtain, but we currently estimate that there are 3,000 to 4,000 Pakistani Christians in Thailand who fled religious persecution and whose cases are pending. Some of them are approved and awaiting resettlement, but some cases are closed and affording them with no place to go. I'd like to feature in today's testimony the case of a Michael D'Souza, who, on account of his denial by the UNHCR in Bangkok, Thailand, of his case, he was forced to stay in their immigration detention facility in deplorable conditions, so much so after 1 year of suffering through that and no hope, he returned to Pakistan. Michael D'Souza was brutalized by the very people he feared would persecute him. His case should not have been denied, and he remains stranded in Karachi, Pakistan. I use his case to demonstrate the fact that cases that are putting forward their claim as believers in a faith should be provided with opportunities to have their cases heard more with more reasonableness. We have found with many of the cases within the UNHCR in Bangkok, there are denials because there's an unreasonable standard and burden of proof placed upon them. We have many cases, as do colleagues of ours, that assist with these refugee processing, where it clearly appears to us that the UNHCR in Bangkok has placed a higher burden of proof on Pakistani Christian asylum seekers. This is something which we have attempted to place attention on. We've approached the UNHCR. They're sympathetic, but the conditions in terms of the interviews have not changed, and we wish to see that change take place. We also wish to point out that the conditions in the immigration detention centers within Bangkok and Thailand are absolutely deplorable. We want to mention the Montagnard asylum seekers from Vietnam who are stranded also in Bangkok. There's upwards of 500 of them, and they're in the horrible situation at the IDC detention center where mothers are separated from their children and not allowed to even give them breastfeeding. So the conditions there are horrible, and this is a very vulnerable religious minority community of Montagnards that need help there. There are many issues that and reasons for why this is taking place that we have submitted within our written submission for my testimony today, and it's my hope that we can enable the UNHCR in Bangkok to do a better job of paying attention to religious minority asylum seeker cases. And finally, I wish to mention that we desperately need additional numbers for refugee resettlement to the United States. We don't believe that there's sufficient attention placed on this vulnerable population of refugees, and we wish to see that the United States admissions program would accept more of them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mace. Hold on one second. Hold on a second. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for having us. Chairwoman Bass, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting us to this hearing. You have my submitted testimony, so I'll be summarizing it today. My name is Ryan Mace, and I am a refugee specialist at Amnesty International USA, a global human rights movement. Last November, I joined an Amnesty delegation traveling to Jordan and Lebanon, where we had the opportunity to hear from dozens of refugees. As global displacement has reached historic highs affecting every region of the world, we must remember this is a global crisis, but people are at its core. Refugees are human beings with human rights, rights that are at risk. Unfortunately, countries around the world have responded with restrictive policies and failed to offer permanent protection on a scale that even begins to match the need. This is borne out with the drastic reduction to refugee resettlement globally and an increase in detention used to deter and punish people who seek asylum. We are now helping lead this race to the bottom. Whether it's the Muslim refugee or asylum bans, increased detention of asylum seekers, or targeting NGO human rights defenders, these policies can rightly be viewed as a violation of human rights. It is no exaggeration to say that the ability of people to seek safety and enjoy lasting protection is not only at risk, it is in crisis. I'd like to tell you about a Syrian refugee family that has been living in Lebanon since 2013. Mr. Amari, father of 4 children, aged 4 to 11, shared his 2 priorities with me. His first is the education of their children. Sadly, more than half of refugee children in Lebanon attend no school at all. His second is to ensure they don't have to rely on others' generosity to get by. In late 2016, they were notified they would be resettled to Richmond, Virginia. They packed up their bags and were ready to go. With the announcement in January 2017 of the Muslim ban, their dreams were shattered. they would not be going to Richmond. "We come in peace," he said to us. "We are looking for security and safety. We are asking for your help." The U.S. refugee program has long been a partnership between the federal government, local communities, and private investment, built up over decades. Today, it's needlessly at risk. At its peak, the program admitted over 200,000. This year, we'll be lucky if we get to 20,000. The dramatic decrease in resettlement has put untenable pressure on refugee-hosting countries around the world. Countries including Turkey, Uganda, Jordan, and Lebanon all host significant populations of refugees, straining their social service programs. In recent years, many countries have designed policies to keep people from ever even accessing their borders. Putting up barrier after barrier to keep them out, states are violating their right to seek asylum, forcing them to wait for weeks or longer in unsafe conditions, or make the terrible decision to take dangerous routes to safety. Since 2016, European governments have practically shut down Mediterranean sea routes that refugees have used in the past, with devastating results. In the US, Amnesty International has documented the dangerous trend of pushing back asylum seekers at the US southern border in a recent report titled, "You Don't Have Any Rights Here." The report title quotes a CBP official speaking to a Brazilian mother in Texas last year as they separated her from her child. That is the message that our frontline officials are communicating to those in search of safety. Unfortunately, many migrants and asylum seekers around the world are detained, often in appalling conditions and for indefinite periods. In Libya, migrants and refugees in detention centers are routinely exposed to torture, extortion, and rape. In the US, over 40,000 people are held in detention any given day. Everyone should have the right to freedom from arbitrary detention, and detention should always be the last resort. The assault on refugees and asylum seekers has now reached such heights that even advocates are targeted. An increasing number of countries are enacting policies to limit refugee rights organizations from doing their critical work. Here in the US, asylum advocates have reportedly been targeted by authorities, including facing criminal prosecution for providing water to exhausted migrants in the desert. Here we are, 2 years later, and the Amari family is still in limbo, without a permanent home, despite one waiting for them here in the US. As an advocate, I feel powerless, but the members of this committee have the power to change this family's life and others like them. These are our recommendations. First, the US should restore its commitment to refugee resettlement. Second, this cannot be the last time this subject is before this committee or this Congress, and glad to hear that that will be the case. Third, this Congress must support legislation that overturns destructive policies that target these populations. And finally, our government has long been a leader in helping displaced populations around the world, and we must continue to play that role. In closing, the world is rightly wondering if the U.S. is still an active partner in offering protection for those who need it most. We need to listen to refugees and asylum seekers and from those directly working with them. I thank the committee and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Swartz.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify on these critical issues. Members have referenced the numbers. At the end of 2017, human rights violations. And 24.5 million of those people were refugees, those outside their countries of origin, and about 40 million were internally displaced. According to the well-respected organization Development Initiatives, governments and the private sector spend over $27 billion annually in humanitarian aid. The United States is the largest donor, but as a percentage of GDP, we're not near the top, and U.S. aid amounts to less than 1% of the federal budget. So what are some of the key issues on refugees and migration confronting this Congress? First, there is the issue of support for refugee solutions, solutions that have been overwhelmingly endorsed by governments in a recently adopted global compact on refugees, solutions which are reflected in international programs supporting education and employment of refugees, in countries like Jordan, like Turkey, like Uganda, like Ethiopia, and others. The United States had been at the forefront of this solutions effort, but frankly, policies have shifted, with the Trump administration pressing for dramatic cuts in humanitarian aid, opposing the global compact on refugees, and slashing U.S. refugee resettlement. Congress has a role to push back against these measures. And the dramatic decrease of refugee resettlement, in particular from Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries, should be the subject of careful oversight. On the challenge of global forced migration generally, and despite the administration's decision to boycott another set of negotiations around a new agreement or a compact on global migration that was also overwhelmingly endorsed by governments, members of Congress should press for substantial increases in support, in funding, for key initiatives that were envisioned in that global migration agreement, including efforts to minimize drivers of forced migration in countries of origin, measures to ensure respect for migrant rights, enhanced pathways for regular migration, and alternatives to migrant detention. On another critical issue, the rights and well-being of refugee women and girls, Congress should seek to lift restrictions on aid for sexual and reproductive health services and on services related to response to gender-based violence, restrictions that have been imposed by the administration and that should be particularly alarming in light of violence against women and girls in places like Burma, otherwise known as Myanmar, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And Congress should reject actions that politicize humanitarian aid. In 1984, it was the Reagan administration that declared that a hungry child knows no politics. And we should be deeply concerned by departures from this principle, reflected, for example, by the administration's decision to end humanitarian aid to Palestinian civilians due to the political positions of Palestinian leaders. This has had serious consequences for life-sustaining assistance, and Congress should protect aid to civilians at risk without discrimination. Finally, Congress can't ignore refugee protection at home, where we have recently witnessed measures that dramatically limit the ability of Central Americans to make claims for asylum. Beyond enacting legislation to ensure that the administration acts consistent with U.S. law and values, Congress should legislate a special Central American refugee and humanitarian resettlement program to address humanitarian challenges at our southern border. We've done it with Soviet Jews. We've done it with Cubans. We can do it with Central Americans. The consensus in our country for respect of refugee rights, that's a consensus that has always been a fragile one, with loud voices of intolerance often appealing to our fears rather than to our ideals and our interests. And this is precisely why, at this moment in history, the voices of members of Congress are so critical. I urge that you use those voices in Washington and beyond the Beltway to ensure a brighter, a more affirming, and a successful future for all Americans. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your patience through our voting and the recess that we took. And would like to ask questions that focus on recommendations for what you think that we could be doing, how we could direct our assistance. Mr. Mace, you talked about restoring the refugee resettlement piece. I'd like for you to elaborate a little more on that. You also spoke about the Muslim ban, and knowing that that's a policy that I don't see changing anytime. But what can we do in terms of, as Congress, as we put legislation forward to support refugees in terms of resources that we could give? What are some examples? And I would ask that of all of the witnesses, but start with Mr. Mace.
Sure, thank you for the question. On resettlement first, just in terms of the recommendation itself, our ask would be to see it restored. This cannot be a new normal. The goal is 30,000 for this fiscal year, and as I said, we won't even get to 20,000 if we continue at this rate. We can't let that be a new normal. We can't let that be a new normal now and in future administrations as well. And would encourage Congress to, through appropriations, make that clear to the administration that that is not what we want. In terms of the Muslim ban, and in terms of Syrians in particular, I spoke of the Amari family from Syria. There are 5.7 million people, Syrians, refugees, and the UNHCR has actually said that they're one of the populations in highest need of resettlement. The U.S. has resettled 40 to date, 40. This fiscal year. I think that anyone could say we can do better than that, especially when we're faced with such need. And I would echo others on the panel that we should really call, as in times past, the Congress has said we're in an emergency, we're in an urgent situation. We need to recognize that. It doesn't matter. We don't need to wait for the end of the fiscal year to do that. I understand the president has a lot of power with setting the refugee admissions goal, but Congress has power too and should reassert that.
Thank you.
I'd like to make a comment to that.
Sure.
I don't see it as a Muslim ban. I see it as a ban specific to countries because we represent Christians in the very same countries that are suffering under the same plight of being unable to come to the United States. And these are minorities within those countries that are subject to the ban. And so I wish to make that point for the record. Thank you.
Mr. Swartz?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and my testimony I thought is very important. So every part of my testimony has a section on what Congress can do, and let me talk a little bit about some ideas there. First, oversight is really important. In 2016, we resettled more than 9,000 Somalis. In 2016, we resettled more than 12,000 Syrians. As of January 31st, those numbers were respectively 14 and 13. Since 9/11, we've resettled 1 million refugees, more or less. In those years, since 2001, there is not one case of an American citizen being killed in an act of terror perpetrated by a resettled refugee. In 10 years, we've had more than 250,000 people killed by gun violence. We've resettled 1 million refugees since 9/11. Not one case of a refugee being responsible for an act of terror that led to the loss of an American life. Yet, we've gone from 9,000 Somalis in 2016 to 14 Somalis in 2018-19. So that requires oversight. You need to get counterterrorism experts who are not in the government to get in here and talk about evidence-based policy. So oversight. Second, I think the Congress can legislate a refugee resettlement program. The president, yes, under our current program, has the authority to determine the number of refugees who come in. But if you want to resettle 100,000 Central American refugees and humanitarian cases and family cases over a 5-year period, you can legislate that. And why not? To create a more orderly process at our border, to practice at home what we are preaching abroad to so many other governments about the importance of the president himself in 2017 at the United Nations declared his focus was that countries should take care of refugees that are closer to their homes. Well, Central America is pretty close to our homes. So that you could legislate coming from this committee. The PRM can implement it. A refugee resettlement, refugee and humanitarian.
What did you say, PRM?
The State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugee, and Migration.
Okay.
Second, I'll just give you a couple of other recommendations. You could legislate support for the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees, an agency that by all impartial accounts, including a General Accounting Office report, has diligently sought to implement humanitarian assistance, yet all of that aid was cut off by the Trump administration. You could legislate programs that have been cut off on the protection of women and girls in humanitarian situations. You can do all of that and much more.
Thank you. Before I go to my esteemed colleague here, my ranking member, it was interesting what you said about Christian minorities in those countries. When the ban was put in place, the target was the Muslim population. I think it's unfortunate that Christians there's consequences for them as well. But remember, that was the original intent. It was changed to be countries for it to follow the Supreme Court. Mr. Ranking Member.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you all for your testimonies. Provides a great deal of guidance and wisdom, I think, for the subcommittee, and we deeply appreciate it, and all of your work for decades in most cases. Let me just ask a couple of questions. Your point, Mr. Schwartz, I think was very well taken about people not being killed by refugees, but there are threats out there, as we all know, and maybe there have been some, but they weren't identified by police or whatever as refugees. But and your point on gun violence, I thought was very well taken as well. There is, right now in the news, we hear about the so-called ISIS bride from Alabama, who has called for sleeper cells with ISIS to kill Americans, especially during patriotic holidays such as Veterans Day and Memorial Day. I remember during the Balkan War, I was there frequently in Bosnia and in Croatia. And when the fighting went into Kosovo, was in Stankovic refugee camp in Macedonia, met with many of the people there. And frankly, the open door welcoming for people from that camp to the United States, many of them disembarked in my district. They came to McGuire Air Force Base. Many of us went out to the airplanes and met them. Some of those people I'm sure I had met when I was in the camp because I was there for hours. But there was one guy who became part of what they called the Fort Dix Five, who had become radicalized at some point. And they were trying, because he lived at Fort Dix, which is adjacent to McGuire, and he was the weapons procurer. And they planned on a mass killing of service members and their families at Fort Dix. They originally intended on bringing pizza, and with it AK-47s and other, to just kill people wantonly and horribly. Luckily, that was thwarted by the FBI and by, so there are threats, and I'm just wondering, you might speak to it, how do we mitigate those threats? How does the vetting process become even more aggressive? I know when we had the last administration here, they talked about very high degrees of vetting, and I know the current administration is doing the same. Secondly, if I could, Ms. Bawalda, you speak very eloquently about the crisis in Thailand, and it's Christians, it's Falun Gong who are being sent back to China. It is Montagnard, the 500 who are being mistreated there, Christians. But your 10 to 30% of the Pakistani Christians that are granted refugee status is appalling. And I'm wondering, what do you recommend we do to hold UNHCR accountable? I've sent letters to them. I've talked to officials. We've talked to the UNHCR, and we seem to get nowhere. Is it a very poor staff on the ground? And Human Rights Watch has spoken about this as well. Or is there something different that we're talking about? There's just not enough people. But what is the problem, and how do we fix that? Because that seems to me to be a huge, huge problem. And your elaboration of the case of Michael D'Souza, after being beaten, goes to Thailand seeking help, comes back to Pakistan, and then, and as you point out, his two sisters-in-law were beaten as well. I mean, if that isn't well-founded fear of persecution, I don't know what is. So hopefully the UNHCR will do a far better job. Many of us have been very concerned with them over the years. The Secretary General, who used to be the head of the UNHCR, I met with him many times when they were sending women who would make their way out of North Korea into China, many of whom would be forced into human trafficking. And as you know, I wrote the laws on human trafficking, including the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. We had women testify here in this room who they were sent back by the Chinese government in clear contravention of the Refugee Convention to which they are signers. Maybe you guys want to speak to that as well, because I find that appalling as well. And just briefly, Mary Eric, you could speak to, many of our concerns with UNRWA is the fomenting of anti-Semitism and anti-Americanism, but particularly anti-Semitism. I've had hearings on that as well. The textbooks, maybe you could speak to whether or not they've been at all cleaned up to get rid of all the anti-Semitic hate that are then inculcated into the minds and hearts of young children under UNRWA. On the humanitarian side, food, medicines, I'm with you. Just get it to whoever is in need, period. But if you could speak to that as well.
Should I respond?
You can start, yeah.
You raised a couple of important issues, Congressman Smith, and thank you. And thank you for your kind words before. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have worked with you on that and other issues through the years. First, let me say that my concern about the UNRWA decision is, I will talk about the issue of UNRWA as an organization in a second. But my concern about the UNRWA decision was it was explicitly and demonstrably an unprincipled decision. The president tweeted one day that if Palestinian political leaders don't essentially, I don't have the quote, but essentially don't toe the political line, we're going to stop aid. And then the next day, the UN Secretary General, in response to a specific question about UNRWA, not general response, a specific question about UNRWA, alluded to the same issue that the president alluded to. If the political leaders don't toe the line, that aid ends. Now, whatever your views about UNRWA, that is obnoxious, unacceptable, and in conflict with American commitment to the good humanitarian donor principles to which we have subscribed, that aid should be based on need, and the political opinions and views of political leaders should not impact whether or not civilians get
interrupt
aid.
one second. How do we get the educational piece fixed?
Okay,
Because
I'm
the
gonna get to
poison that is
I'm
conveyed
gonna
to
get
these
that,
young
but-
people.
So my point was that decision was an unprincipled decision. My second point is that I would refer you to the General Accounting Office's, I believe it was 2017, or the General Accountability Office, their name has changed, 2017 report on UNRWA. And I think what it demonstrates is this is an organization which is doing the very best it can and doing good work in trying to ensure that principles of tolerance and impartiality are promoted in its materials under very difficult circumstances. And if UNRWA wasn't doing that, nobody would. And so I would refer all members of Congress to that GAO report, because from my perspective, it reveals that this is an organization that is operating in a difficult environment and doing very good work in trying to push principles of tolerance, impartiality, aid based on need, human rights promotion, in circumstances where they're using, national curriculum, et cetera. So they're pushing against efforts at discrimination and bias. That doesn't mean they're completely successful in eliminating it, but they are pushing in the right direction. Should I address your security question? Because I don't want to. Okay, please. I can wait.
Why don't we
Sure.
have the other two people respond? We're quite a bit over time, and I want to give my other colleagues a chance to ask questions.
I would like to speak to your question with regard to the UNHCR's adjudication, and I believe that there's definite need of improvement. One of the reasons for why it occurred in terms of denial rates being so high is that they have an unbalanced burden of proof placed upon them. The skepticism, we had a UNHCR official describe how just the basic skepticism of Pakistani Christians, asylum seekers there, that demonstrated that they are probably system-wide within Bangkok not effectively handling these cases. From 2016 to 2017, there was an effort to bring backlogs down. What they did was rush cases through. The fastest way for doing that is to deny them. And that also came with adverse credibility claims. With an adverse credibility claim, you have almost no chance on any appeal and you're left hopeless. The anecdotal evidence we have and information we have is significant in terms of the numbers. I would also like to point out that the UNHCR their own reports are demonstrating that Pakistani Christians suffer persecution. One of the examples I gave in my testimony I submitted is that of Talib Masih. Talib Masih was listed in their own report prior to them denying his case for asylum in Bangkok. And we worked very hard. His case has been reversed, but now he has no place to go. He can't come. He's not been referred to any country at this stage 1 year later for resettlement. So we're remaining concerned about him and others that should be resettled.
And if I may briefly, just on UNRWA, I'll say that when I was in Jordan and Lebanon, we also went to Palestinian refugee camps. It was one of the first places we went. And I just echo what you said, Congressman, that ultimately it's about ensuring this aid gets to those who need it most. Shatila camp we were in Beirut, it's one of the most overcrowded places, and because of the Syrian refugee crisis, it's the numbers, it is just, the density is extreme. And we asked people at UNRWA about what do these cuts tangibly mean. Education was one of the first things they said, and that, you know, other donors have helped fill in the gaps, but they were very worried about what the years to come mean if the U.S. doesn't restore its commitment, and would certainly encourage them to come before this committee or the full committee to really hear from them, because I definitely think that they would have much to say in response to you. Just on the vetting, I just want to say that of refugees in general, the refugees who are resettled to the U.S. are by far and away the most vetted of any population, period, probably in the world. And certainly we should always look to improve this program and make sure that this program is safe. We want this program to be safe. It is safe. And I think that this president, the previous presidents have looked to that. And let's make sure this program works and is actually doing the goals that we set out at the start of the year, which it's currently not.
Representative Wild.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of you for being here to educate us about what I consider to be a very, very important issue. Mr. Mace, you sort of anticipated the question that I was going to ask Ms. Buwalda, but I'm going to go ahead and ask her at this point. There is a perception, which is, I believe, not true, that refugees are not properly vetted. And this may be perpetuated by our administration, maybe it's not. But could you address, without going into exhaustive detail, the type of vetting that refugees undergo before they are allowed to come and live here?
Yes, Congresswoman. The vetting system is very detailed and multi-layered. There's actually a very in-depth review that takes place. There are all kinds of background checks. There's even, as I understand it, DNA testing. In certain communities, such as in Syria, they go to the neighborhoods where the person claims to be from to determine whether those neighborhoods had terrorist activities, et cetera. There is a databases that overlap in terms of how vetting takes place. I am completely in agreement with my co-panelists here that the vetting process is extensive, and I do believe that there may always be room for improvement, but I do believe that the vetting process is extensive on this population, and consequently, it is amongst the lowest populations that we would have a threat from. There are other types, I'm an immigration attorney, there's other types of visas where there is no vetting. And so this is significant vetting that does take place.
And how long does the process take, if you know?
Due to the overlapping, it can be, the shortest is well over a year, and the longest ones, because of overlapping, one will expire, another one start, can be 2-3 years.
Thank you. Mr. Mace, I've heard it said that the vast majority of people, wherever they're born, would prefer to stay in their home country if they can do so safely and receive adequate nutrition and so forth. Has that been your experience and what you've observed?
In terms of people wanting to go back to their home country?
Or I guess my question is really based, and it's more of a statement, I suppose, that refugees are leaving untenable situations. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, and I think it's important to note that no one wants to leave their home. But if you're forced to based on what you believe a war, violence, that's not a choice. And, you know, when we were in Jordan and Lebanon, we met, almost 100 refugees throughout the course of our trip. And we would always ask, you know, Syrians in particular, we would ask, do you feel comfortable to go home? Every single one said, no, not right now. Some would say, I'd like to go back, but the conditions aren't right now. And then some said, I'll never be able to go back. If I go back, I have nothing to go back to. If we go back, my son will be conscripted into the army. My name is on, these are just different things that people do. My name's on a list. And if I go back, I will die. Someone point blank said that. So I think that it just goes to the point that, yes, some people do want to go back, but the conditions aren't right. And unfortunately, these crises that we're talking about, they just go on. And we're seeing people who live in protracted displacement, intergenerational refugees. I mean, I met children of refugees who were born in the country that they're in now. So, yeah.
Thank you. I want to ask you a follow-up to that, and it may sound like a rhetorical softball question, but it's actually one that I would like to hear you articulate about, and the other, Mr. Schwartz and Ms. Buwalda also, if you care to. And that is, why is it important for the United States to lead the way in this humanitarian crisis? And I ask you that from the perspective of a legislator who has a district where a number of my constituents may very well articulate the idea that we should just be taking care of what's happening right here in America, and why do we need to get involved with people from around the world who are suffering through these humanitarian crises. So give us some words of, some pearls of wisdom of what we can say to address that to people who express that.
Sure, I'd love to speak briefly and hear from my colleagues here. First of all, I think when the U.S. leads, others follow. And, you know, we don't have to look that far back when we were the leader. We're not the leader in resettlement anymore, period. And last year in 2018, not the calendar year, there were a little over 55,000 people who were resettled, not to the U.S., globally, and 22,000 or so of which was in the U.S. So we're not even the leader anymore. A few years ago, it was well over 100,000. There are 1.4 million people who need access to resettlement. I think anyone can say the U.S. can do better. And importantly, on the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, it's a program that started in 1980 with the 1980 Refugee Act. It's a program that's been built up, like I said, with communities like yours all across the country, and it benefits our communities. It revitalizes. Refugees are everything and anything because they're just like us. So I just don't understand anyone who says that refugees don't contribute to the United States. And we've seen that not only here in the U.S., but all around the world.
Thank you. I'm going to actually ask you, Mr. Schwartz, but rather than going into that question, because I saw something in your written testimony that I didn't hear talked about today, and that is what the effect of the global gag rule is on this crisis. And you mentioned it in your written testimony, and I'd just like to hear from you briefly on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, the restrictions against provision of these services to women, if the organizations concerned provide abortion-related services, even if they are not being done with U.S. funds, is a significant problem. Now, the State Department and USAID, emergency assistance is exempted. However, there is a lot of assistance that goes to the building of resilience that is critical for humanitarian emergencies that is cut off, and of significant concern also is the complete cutoff of support for the UN Fund for Population Activities, which includes critically important assistance for services related to sexual and reproductive health, for prevention and response to gender-based violence. But I also want to comment on your last question. I mean, nobody suggests that the United States or the countries of the global north will resettle the majority of the world's refugees. Even at 1.4 million, you're at about 4%, 4 or 5%, maybe 4 or 6%. But if the government of Turkey is hosting 3.5 million refugees, if the government of Jordan is hosting upwards of 1 million refugees, if the government of Bangladesh is hosting 1 million refugees, if Ethiopia is hosting 900,000 refugees or more, and we're going around the world saying to these governments, this is what you must do. This is your responsibility. How in heaven's name can we not demonstrate that we have skin in the game, that we're going to demonstrate a modicum of leadership by saying perhaps we'll resettle 100,000 refugees, which is a drop in the bucket. And so it's really critically important we do that. Finally, I mean, if members care, I ran the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program. I don't want to take too much of your time, but I'd be
Yes,
happy
we
to
need
talk
to move
about
on.
the security issues.
Madam
should you
Chair
like
has
me
told
to.
me my time is up, and it's my fault for asking very extensive questions. I pass to Representative Omar.
Thank you, Chairwoman Bass. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being part of this important discussion. It's interesting to hear people say, I wonder what this process is, or what refugees are like in the United States. But as a refugee and as someone who's gone through the process of vetting, I know the many years my family waited in a refugee camp to be able to resettle in the United States. And I know with certainty the kind of anxieties that a lot of families have as they await the opportunity to get resettled and start a new life. I just wanted to kind of look at and follow with the line of questioning that Congresswoman Wild had around what happens when we lower the refugee cap here, and how that could lead to other countries following pursuit and lowering the cap of refugees that they welcome into their own countries. And we're at risk of that because when we lead, others follow. And I think we're setting a really bad example around the world right now. But I wanted to also uplift what these particular policies that this administration has is really all about. According to the refugee processing portal, 68.1% of the 22,491 refugees admitted in 2018 were Christians. 15.5 were Muslim. 9.3 were animist, Buddhist, or Hindu. Only 369 refugees were admitted from the countries included in the modified travel ban or the Muslim ban. The breakdown is as such. From Chad, only one refugee was admitted who was Muslim, and in totality, only one person. In Iran, 41 were admitted. Of that 41, 23 were Christians, 8 Muslims, 5 Baha'i, and 3 Siberian Mendinian, 1 Jewish, and 1 had not declared a faith. From Libya, we only admitted 1 person, and that person was Muslim. From North Korea, we admitted 5, 4 Christians, 1 Buddhist. From Syria, we admitted 62, 42 were Muslim, 20 were Christians. From Somalia, we admitted 257, Venezuela 0, and 2 from Yemen. So when we think about and we consider the harsh crackdowns on asylum seekers from Central America, the policy that is the Muslim ban, and the sharp drop in the refugee resettlement during this administration, do you, Mr. Schwartz, agree that the president's immigration policies are not really based on whether we favor legal or illegal, whether it is about safety and security, but it's rather about the kind of people that we think we should be welcoming into this country?
I am deeply concerned, Representative Omar, as the as the former dean of a public affairs school that sits in your district, that hosted at our school many Somali students, I am concerned about the dramatic decline in resettlement of refugees from Muslim-majority countries. I think it merits the scrutiny of the Congress, and it is a source of concern. I think it relates, generally speaking, to, this isn't a mystery, the administration and the president has said that he doesn't really want the United States to be resettling very many refugees. I mean, it is what it is. The reason I think this happens, and this relates to the security question, is, look, security screening is very important, and the FBI is involved in it, the intelligence community is involved in it, the Department of Homeland Security is involved in it. It can be a complete obstacle to resettlement of refugees from Muslim-majority countries, or it doesn't have to be. And the difference is leadership. If the President of the United States said to those agencies, this has to work, and I am going to throw the resources necessary in terms of adjudicators, in terms of intelligence, etc., to meet the objective of resettling reasonable numbers of these populations, it would happen. But it's not happening because this administration is just not interested in that outcome, so it's not prepared to devote the resources necessary to get through the process. That is what's happening. And I think it is very unfortunate. As a practical matter, the way Congress can address the resettlement issue, at this point in this administration, because of the plenary authority of the president to decide how many refugees are coming in every year, the way you can address it is the way I suggested in my testimony. Get consensus on a Central American refugee resettlement program or some resettlement program and legislate it. And that's how you can affect it. But with the president's posture on this issue and his untrammeled authority to decide how many people are going to come in, the Congress is not going to significantly alter that process. It's just not going to happen. And it's tragic, and it's a tragedy, and it speaks poorly about who we are as a country, but it is what it is.
So sometimes there are a lot of conversations we have that are not really rooted in fact. There are people within my home state of Minnesota who, will say there are thousands of Somalis coming in every single day being resettled without your knowledge. The president himself was unfortunately in my state and said something to that regard. And in the last year, one Somali family was resettled in our state. But I also want to go back to a statement that was made on the committee and just kind of have some facts be used to address that. The ISIS Pride was mentioned, and it is a fact that the ISIS Pride was not a refugee that was resettled in this country. It is a fact that she was not an immigrant, but an American born to a family of diplomats. And so I would love to hear from you, Mr. Schultz, or any of the panelists, when you stated earlier that refugees are the most vetted and have not been part of causing terror or taking American lives in this country. Can you actually address that with some actual facts? Do you have numbers or some things to help us cleanse us of this hateful rhetoric that we have developed in thinking that people who are coming to this country to seek a new life are the ones that are causing us harm, and one that is making our communities unsafe and turning us against each other? Because for the most of Minnesotans who are of refugee background, most of us came as children. And we went through years of vetting and went through the process of becoming citizen. I mean, we have been fingerprinted, tested more than any American has ever been who's born in this country. And so it is saddens me, and it's frustrating really and angering to hear people say that we are a threat to society when we are tested and policed and surveilled more than any member of our society. So can you please help me out and put some facts to this?
Well, actually, we've gone over on time, so if one of you want to briefly respond, and then I want to make a few comments before I move on to Ms. Houlihan.
Well, just very briefly, I think security screening is legitimate, but I also think policy has to be evidence-based. I think if you have an immigration program, and we have an immigration program, some of the people who come into your country are going to commit crimes at lower rates than Native Americans, but that's going to happen. So policy has to be evidence-based. And I think we have durable and responsible screening procedures. The Cato Institute, a conservative think tank in Washington, estimated that between 1975 and 2015, the likelihood of an American losing their lives at the hands of a refugee was 1 in 3.64 billion, which means almost non-existent. And so I think policy has to be evidence-based. We have to have responsible screening procedures, but policies have to be evidence-based.
Thank you. So before we move on to our last member, let me just say that in this hearing, we went over beyond 5 minutes because it's difficult when one person does it, then not to allow everyone else. In the future, though, I do want our hearings to stick to 5 minutes. And then after everybody has had a chance to speak, if there's time left, then we can have people return for a second round. Representative Houlihan.
Thank you, and thank you to my colleagues as well for their impassioned conversation, and to you all for coming today, and to Mr. Bass and to Mr. Schwartz for spending time with me last week on the phone and bringing me up to speed on this. I'm the daughter of a refugee who came here 70 years ago, and these issues are critically important to me as well. And I'm trying to find solutions, just like I think everyone here, to being the nation that we've been promised and the nation that has given us so much as both of us sitting here on the stage, many of us here. And so what I'm trying to figure out, though, also is that I'm also from a community that is struggling right now. They have jobs that are open, and they cannot find people to fill those jobs. And they are in danger, in the case of one industry in particular, of literally going out of business. 5 generations of people have farmed mushrooms in my community. We no longer can find the labor who would like to do this, and those businesses are going under. And so what I'm trying to understand is, in a world where we have these caps, which are not being met, in a world where we have these jobs which are being unmet as well, how do I help as a legislator to match the supply and the demand without being, crass about human lives? I'm just trying to figure out how it is that we can figure out how to match what is clearly a group of people who would desperately like to fill those jobs and desperately like to be part of the American dream, and a community that would desperately like to have them be there. And so I'm wondering from you all, have you seen any programs that work that can marry up these, two groups with one another? Is there anything that you've seen either kind of at the state or local level, or frankly at the federal level? We spoke about the idea of having this special Central American refugee policy. I was really intrigued about that. Can you put some bones to that kind of an idea? And that, I think, is largely the largest part of my question.
I would just say briefly that, first of all, when I was in the region, one of the very first things people would say, besides education, if they had kids, it was always education to their kids, and then, I want to work. I want to have a meaningful job. And whether that's in the country they're in or if they're resettled, everyone wants to work. They don't want to be reliant on aid. In terms of that, I think that it's not surprising you've heard from people in your district. All across the country, there are so many different industries and places that actually benefit from refugees, immigrants, asylees. Refugees, immigrants, they contribute to our country in so many vibrant ways. And I think the first thing I would say is, in terms of refugee program, when we're talking about that, we just need to call for an increase in the program. I think that there's other ways of looking at it, and I would say that it might be worth exploring. You know, at Amnesty International, we have a community sponsorship program where we encourage Amnesty members to sign up to be sponsors of refugees aligned with their local resettlement agency like LIRS, IRC, HIAS. And I think that there's innovative things that we could look to say, maybe there's ways that we can work together. But I think it's important to note that what makes our program, the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, such a good one, is that we don't value people based on their education, based on anything except to say who's most in need, who's most vulnerable. And that's where the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program should always start.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that if you're looking, I presume you're not talking about the regular immigration law means of, you know, bringing employees in. And so, you know, what Mr. May said is true. The refugee program has been very kind of pristine in that it has focused on refugee admissions based on the 5 criteria related to persecution. And I honor that. But I would not oppose, and I think a special initiative focused on Central America that broadened the categories to include forced migrants. Not every forced migrant is a refugee, but people who feel that they need to leave their homes, and we all would agree they should be leaving their homes due to violence and other factors. Forced migrants, you know, are in need. And in this special situation, I think there are opportunities for special legislation that captures both refugees and other forced migrants. I would refer you to a Washington Post piece by Roberto Soro of USC and Alex Alenikoff of the New School, the former INS legal counsel, that discusses this particular program in some detail.
Thank you very much. I will yield back.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Mr. Smith, would you like to?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And again, thank you for calling this very important hearing. I did want to ask Mr. Schwartz, if I could, you know, you mentioned the GAO report, which I've read, but there was a declassified GAO report, as you know, that just came out, and that tells a different story, a profoundly different story with regards to UNRWA and the textbooks. It does point out that UNRWA and state have taken steps to identify and address potentially problematic content of textbooks used in UNRWA schools, and there's about 370 of those schools. But then it says, due to financial shortfalls, and this is before there was any cut, UNRWA officials told GAO that UNRWA did not train teachers or distribute the complementary teaching materials. They point out in their report, this is GAO again, that there was inaccurate information conveyed by the U.S. Department of State to Congress and omitted potentially useful information. And bottom line, without a fuller explanation, Congress may not have the information it needs to oversee efforts to identify and address potentially problematic textbook content. So my concern is, are we talking about an initiative that looked good, had a great deal of surface appeal, but when it came down to implementation was an absolute sham? And this GAO report, the one that was just declassified, makes it pretty clear that there are really serious problems. And I've had hearings myself in this hearing room where textbooks that are used to train to educate young Palestinian children contain the most horrific hate against Jews imaginable. And, you know, that is absolutely unacceptable. You know, remember in that great South Pacific, Rodgers and Hammerstein, there's a famous song in there, "You've got to be taught to hate," that it needs, you know, it's inculcated in the minds of these young people. Well, if the textbooks are rife with anti-Semitic hatred, that needs to be called out and excised, and that is what we've been calling for. I've met with the UNRWA board many times myself in the past and kept calling for that, and now we have a GAO report that makes it pretty clear. Still a problem. You know, they did what looked like on the surface was something, then it wasn't implemented at the school. Secondly, and I would just say this for the record, and I know we have a fundamental difference when it comes to the right to life issue. I believe that unborn children should be respected, that abortion is violence against children. Whether it's dismemberment or chemical poisoning, the end result is the same. That child, that girl, or that boy dies. And I do believe that there are 2 victims in every abortion, both the mother and the baby. That said, in 1984, when Ronald Reagan announced the Mexico City policy, there were many people who said, nobody will accept these terms and conditions. I offered the amendment in 1984 on the floor of the House to protect the Mexico City policy, and that argument was made over and over and over again by my very distinguished and respected colleagues, who I like and respect, but disagreed on this issue. Now we found out during Reagan, Bush, and Bush, who had the Mexico City policy in place, that just about everybody accepted those terms and conditions, because we don't want to be in the position of facilitating the killing of unborn children. You know, I know you know this, and I think most people know it. Just look at what first baby pictures are now all about. The picture of the child in utero, the ultrasound, and parents proudly send that out to grandparents and friends and say, here's what the little girl, a little boy looks like, and abortion is the antithesis of that, because it either dismembers that little baby or kills that baby with chemical poisoning. We are, out of abundance of concern for children, the new Protect Life policy in global health is designed to say, let's look at birth as an event. It's not the beginning of life, but as an event, and protect to the greatest extent possible those children. And the original, or the current analysis is almost every foreign NGO in the world, not all, but almost every one, has accepted the terms and conditions that have been promulgated by the administration. So the money is flowing. It's flowing to organizations that are doing the great work on the ground. So I do believe someday people will look back upon us and say, how could a country that so strongly protected other human rights could not see that those children had value and worth? I know we disagree, but that's where I'm coming from. They are children. They deserve our respect and hopefully our protection, and minimally not our financial facilitation of their demise. But if you could maybe speak to this one as well.
Yes, I have to respond. I just have to comment. First of all,
Yes.
Representative Smith, you know how much I admire your commitment to humanitarianism and to the rights and well-being of refugees. It goes without saying. We have some differences. On the UNRWA issue, I was referring to the unclassified report, to the classified report. I was not referring to an unclassified report. I have a different view on that report because I believe that in an imperfect world, an organization operating in an extremely difficult climate, I believe that organization is a force for positive movement on humanitarian issues, and I believe that their removal from that situation, which would be facilitated by a U.S. cut in aid, would have dramatic and negative implications for the Palestinian people. And if I can take off my refugees hat, or international hat for a second, I also believe it would have negative political consequences. I think it would strengthen the position of radicals in the region. So that's my first point on UNRWA. On the other issue, I am not advocating U.S. support for abortion-related services, but I am saying that I think this policy, because it prevents assistance to organizations with other funds that undertake such activities, I believe this policy does more harm than good. And I also, and so we have a difference of opinion about that.
So let me just, before I close us out, Representative Omar? Sure.
Sorry, thank you. I just thought of, I had a roundtable on immigration issues for Recess Week in my district. And 2 of the participants were lawyers who went to go help in our southern border to assist some of the asylum seekers there. And they were speaking about some of the things that they witnessed. And I just noticed that, Mr. Schwartz, you had mentioned it in your testimony. And so I wanted to ask you about this policy of metering and whether it is within international law to do that. And then wanted to ask you about what has our historic capacity at that border crossing been, and what does processing look like right now?
Well, understanding the lateness of the hour, I will try to be very brief.
Thank you.
The testimony speaks for itself. I think that practices of the administration have run afoul of our commitments under the Refugee Convention and Protocol and under U.S. implementing legislation around that. Criminalizing people who cross between ports of entry is in violation of Article 33 of the convention, because it says to somebody who crosses, we're going to put you in prison first and charge you, and then maybe we'll consider whether or not you're a refugee. That's not the way to do it. So I have concern about that. I have concern about a policy that returns people to Mexico in circumstances where the conditions in northern Mexico are very dangerous, where people don't have access to lawyers, where there's very little, no due process, and the risk of return to situations where people's lives or freedom may be threatened. So for all of those reasons, I think Congress should be acting to legislate remedies here, and I think the policy is an unfortunate one.
Thank you very much. Before I wrap up, though, I want to thank all of the witnesses for your testimony, for your time, and for your recommendations. And as my colleague said, we do have differences of opinion. We have differences of opinion when it comes to a woman's right to choose. And as a mother and as a grandmother, it's kind of difficult to hear the descriptions of what an abortion is or what an abortion isn't. And what I worry about is that when we have policies that try to govern what women do with their bodies, it really only applies to poor women. And that's my concern. And I worry about women in other countries, that there's cases in Central America where women are criminalized, incarcerated because they had a miscarriage, and it's not clear whether it was a miscarriage because of natural reasons or it was an abortion. And so in 2019, the idea that many countries are still criminalizing women is of great concern to me. And I just kind of hope when we move forward in this committee that, we acknowledge the differences, but sometimes I don't think the graphic descriptions are necessary for a point to be made. And with that, I adjourn.